All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. I'm Sheila. I am Signet's president and COO. And Signet does a lot of things. And probably the biggest thing that we do is college admissions. And of course, we approach it through a really holistic lens. And then we have a comprehensive suite of tutoring and coaching and standardized test prep that goes along to support all of our students on their journey in the college process. And today I'm really pleased to introduce you to Joanna Graham, who is a new consultant with Signet, but certainly not new to this business. I'm not going to read a bio, and I'm just going to introduce you very briefly, Joanna, and then you can elaborate on any piece you'd like to. Joanna is a former Georgetown admissions officer, a marketing executive, and has run her own college consulting practice for almost 20 years, right? So she's definitely a veteran, and she's a lovely person, and we have been so impressed with the work that she's already done with our students, even after just a few months. So I'm really pleased to introduce you to her today to talk about the sort of intersection of her areas of expertise between branding and college admissions, and how we can use the idea of a personal brand to help guide students along their path in high school, and of course, as they're completing their college application. So Joanna, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And I guess good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where folks are logging on. I am in lovely Reston, Virginia, so just right outside of Washington, D.C. So it's 5:30 in the afternoon / early evening. Just to get started, I know we've got a small group here, but mighty group. I would love to just get a sense, if you wouldn't mind dropping in the chat, where are you dialing in from, and where sort of where are you in the process? Do you have a child who's already in high school? Are you a super early go-getter? Do you have a child who's in middle school? And also just feel free to start populating questions as well. This is definitely designed to be an interactive session. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, and Sheila has graciously volunteered to help facilitate that. So I see Los Angeles. Oh, we've got two 11th graders. We've got Boston juniors. Oh, a lot of juniors. Oh, senior in North Carolina. Another Boston junior. Arlington. I saw Arlington for a second. I thought Arlington, Virginia, but it's Arlington, Mass. Oh, we've got Florida. Let's see, a lot. Yep, a lot of juniors. So fantastic. This is wonderful. This is wonderful to see. So I will give while that is populating, I'll start by just giving a brief intro on myself. So as Sheila mentioned, I've been with Signet now for a couple of months, but admittedly, this is my 22nd admission cycle that I have coached students in. That makes me feel a lot older than it's than it should, I think.
At heart.
No, but as Sheila mentioned, so I did read applications at Georgetown for 2 years, but I've spent the bulk of my career actually in the nonprofit and education space. I was the product manager for the GMAT exam for almost a decade. I've also been a chief marketing and product officer at the world's largest HR certification and training organization. So really sort of leaned into education, adult learning, professional development in various stages in the process. And as Sheila mentioned, I've worn quite a few hats as well. And so, when I think about the work that I've done, particularly in branding and product marketing, I think that that really sort of, I think, explains the approach that I take to working with students when it comes to higher ed and admissions. And that is that, at the end of the day, college admissions and college applications are really very much an exercise in product market fit. And so working with students to really start thinking about and articulating what that personal brand is. And, it's interesting. I was chatting with a group of parents recently, giving a very similar talk. And, I had a parent ask a little bit about, well, what if the brand, why does it have to be a brand? We talk about letting kids explore and letting them go off to college to find themselves. Why do we have to label them and put them in a box? And, and I think, and you'll see as we chat today, brands are not just about labeling someone as one particular thing. Brands certainly evolve, but I think especially for high school students, talking about building a brand really gives them a framework around which they can think about how do they talk about all these wonderful things that they've been doing for the last 4 years? How do they highlight some of these differentiators? And then when they're thinking about how to talk to universities, how do they take all these wonderful things and align them with exactly what universities are telling them they're looking for? So we will go ahead and dive in. Let's see, Sheila, do you wouldn't mind sharing your screen, and we'll go ahead and dive right in. Fantastic. See, so the first, let's see, and I think we can advance maybe a slide or two. Wonderful. So we're gonna just sort of start off with sort of a high level, and I apologize for any of you who do work in marketing or branding. This will this will probably be a little bit of a little redundant for you all. But I always like to start the conversation off just by talking about what brands are, and and it's interesting because I'll be honest, I feel like in some ways with this slide I talk a little bit out of both sides of my mouth, because the first thing I'm going to tell you is that brands are not logos or slogans. But here you go, you've got company names, you've got logos, insignias up here. The idea behind a brand really is that it is designed to elicit a reaction of some sort, and that can be a positive or a negative reaction. And so the whole idea, I think what good brands do is just that. They get people to feel some sort of emotional response, and that could be a positive or negative thing. And so we'll go through our own little branding exercise, or maybe branding test in our next couple of slides. So next slide. Thank you. So I would love, feel free to take yourselves off mute, or feel free to pop in the chat. So when you see this, this cup with a brown liquid inside, what does everyone start thinking about? Bonus points if you have a tiny human under the age of 5. There's usually a very visceral reaction if you're like myself. Any thoughts? Any thoughts on our white cup here? Definitely hot. So I don't know. I will say with what brand? So that's a great question. So what I will say is that when I see this, particularly if I'm giving this presentation to folks at 8 or 9 in the morning, you can always tell who the parents of young children are, because you see a lot of hands just start going like this, or you see a lot of eyes get really, really big. The idea here behind the cup of coffee or the cup of hot chocolate or the cup of tea or whatever you might assume this to be is that without a brand, it's you're really sort of on your own to kind of think about what this actually means to you. It could mean a lot of different personal things, but it doesn't necessarily elicit a pure gut reaction or emotion for most folks. But now, if we take a look at our next slide and let's slap a brand on it, what do folks start thinking now? I know. I always know. I know we've got some New Englanders, so I'm just waiting for someone to say, "Where's the Dunkin' Donuts logo? Why does it have to? Why does it have to be Starbucks? Expensive, still hot and bitter. Yep, high dollars." I think for some folks, I think there's a natural association between a higher price point and a certain type of quality that is expected when you start thinking about that type of brand. It's interesting for folks on the West Coast, when I'm in the Bay Area talking about coffee, I always ask, I always get someone who will inevitably raise their hand and say, well, what about Blue Bottle? What about all the artisanal types of coffee brands? In Boston and New England, again, I always get comments about Dunkin'. On the rare occasion I'm out of the country, every once in a while I get someone asking, why can't you put a Tim Hortons cup on the slide? At the end of the day, it's not so much about the logo or the brand that's on the coffee cup, but it's more of the reaction. So in just taking a quick peek at the chat, you see that there were much stronger reactions when you saw the coffee cup with the Starbucks label on it. And again, that could be positive or negative. And the fact of the matter is, for brands, brands are not necessarily going to care if it's a positive or negative reaction, although they would obviously prefer positive. The whole idea of a brand here is that these companies want to elicit some type of reaction, because that is going to start creating a memory, and hopefully it'll make something a topic of conversation. So if we move on to our next slide, we can talk a little bit more about brands at large. And so, as I mentioned, brands are really what people think or feel about products, services, or organizations. And so, as you can see here, there's a really broad sampling of a variety of different companies and brands. And if you look at these, they really do tend to fall into 5 buckets. And granted, some of these could be debatable. I realize I built this slide before Tesla's leader took over X, and so I will say more recently than not, that one has definitely elicited some strong reactions. But as you can see, for the most part, these are brands that are definitely sort of bucketed into different categories, and these companies spend an exorbitant amount of money and do quite a bit of research to make sure that the image that they're projecting, the positioning that they're putting out in the marketplace, aligns with some of these core sentiments, because this is the type of perception they want to create in the public marketplace. So you might be asking, so what does this mean necessarily for us as we're building brands for our children? And so we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So what this means is, we are bombarded by content. And what this means basically is that there's a ton of white noise out there. And so if you think about TikTok, they have over 1 billion users worldwide. If you think about Instagram, there are over 3.2 billion images that are uploaded every single day. There are over 1.3 billion websites on the internet. Although interestingly enough, only 200 million of them are actually active websites, which I always find to be kind of fascinating. And depending on if you remember this or not, there are always these viral trends going around. So I think a couple of years ago, there was probably a month where all I saw were pictures of cats and sandwich bread plastered all over my social media feed. The point of this is just to say that there's a ton of white noise. It is really hard to stand out. And when you start thinking about the college admissions process, this is a lot of the anxiety that students start feeling because there's a ton of noise out there. And for a lot of students who are bright, who are talented, who are used to being special and standing out in their high school or in their community, this is a really big transition. It's a huge transition because you're talking about going from being a big fish in a small pond to potentially moving into, to continue the analogy, a lake or an ocean where there's a high probability they're going to be a much smaller fish. And so how do you stand out? And this is where the essence of branding comes in. So when we, I'll be honest, I put this slide together when I'm talking to high school students, but also parents, because I'm always curious to see what the frame of reference that students have for current events actually is. But I like this slide a lot because when you think about the folks up here, and feel free to drop in the chat if you have any thoughts on in terms of what types of brands or feelings you have when you see some of these folks. I think, I've selected a wide variety of folks because I think that they've done a really good job of building not just one brand, but multiple brands. I think, a lot of folks see Rihanna, they think of her, they know that she's incredibly successful as a musical artist, but also as in the beauty space. But it's interesting, what I don't think a lot of people realize is that music isn't actually what made Rihanna a billionaire. It was the beauty brands that she started building and investing in. She is the richest female musician in the world and the second richest female entertainer, just behind Oprah. But when you think about sort of that immediate knee-jerk reaction when you see her image, though, it's not always beauty that necessarily pops up. Usually people first think about music. When you think about someone like Jose Andres, for me being in the DC area, I mean, for the last 15, 20 years, he has been a household name in DC, not because of his organization, World Central Kitchen, but because if you want authentic paella, his restaurants were the ones that you went to in downtown DC. He is an amazing chef. And I think sometimes folks will oftentimes forget about that because he has been across the news so frequently with all of the humanitarian work that he has done around the globe. And I don't think he, if you were to talk to him, I think he would tell most folks that he didn't set out to necessarily build an alternate brand for himself. He just went where he felt he had purpose, and where his gut was telling him to go. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of building brands as well. I think, Zelensky is a very interesting figure as well. Again, up until a couple of years ago, folks probably were not tracking him. A lot of folks don't realize that he was actually an actor and a comedian long before he became the president of Ukraine. And so again, when you think about sort of evolving brands and evolving images, these are all individuals who have done a really great job, either intentionally or not, but reinventing themselves and building multiple brands for themselves. So when we talk about building a brand, there really are there are three foundations to this. And the idea here is that you have expertise, purpose, and authenticity. For most students, when I raise the idea of expertise, the very first thing that they will say to me is, well, I'm really great in math, or I'm a total STEM kid, or I love the humanities. I want to be an English lit major. Expertise is more than just a single talent or a skill. And what I try to remind students, again, if students are, I'll keep going back to this example or harping on this idea that, if students are used to being a big fish in a small pond, if they are used to standing out in the classroom, when you start thinking about that broader competitive pool, all of a sudden, it's not enough to just be really good at math. It's not enough to just be the person who got a 5 on the AP Lit exam. I'll share this detail sometimes or the statistics sometimes with students just to give them a sense. In 2022, Harvard had over 4,000 high school valedictorians apply for 2,000 spots. I guarantee you all 4,000 of those students thought that, that they were experts in something academic. Even if you are the smart one or the really intelligent one in high school, when you start looking at a competitive school, you have to recognize that everyone around you is also going to be smart. And so you need to start thinking about what else am I really good at? I'm glad that I have a lot of parents on this call, because when I use this example with high schoolers, they start looking at me with blank stares. But if any of you remember the movie The Breakfast Club, you had your jock, you had your princess, you had the brain, you had your rebel, you had your recluse, you had folks who all had sort of very distinct personal brands, and whether or not those brands or labels were things that they owned intentionally or things that were applied, they each were an expert in something very, very different. And so I encourage students to start thinking about, what else are you experts in? What else are you very good at? And it doesn't have to just be something academic. Authenticity goes hand in hand with this. And so the idea here with authenticity is that, in the Common App actually has an essay prompt about this. Talk about something unique that your application would be incomplete without. When you think about what makes you, you, that is your authentic self. And so I encourage students to think about this hand in hand with expertise. Again, when you start thinking about how you define this brand, this personal brand of yours, what are the things that make you, you? I had a student a couple of years ago I worked with, and as we were working on his application, I asked him about something that he was really, again, do you have like a hidden superpower? Do you have a hidden talent that really says a lot about you? And he told me that he has a Guinness World Record for something. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. What is it? And he told me this interesting story about how he had a Guinness World Record for something called pillow spinning. And if you're wondering, it is exactly what it sounds like. It's quite literally putting a pillow on your finger and spinning it without having it fall off. And he has a Guinness World Record in this. And it was funny because when we started digging into this more deeply, because I mean, frankly, I asked him, like, how in the world did you discover you had this talent? And it was, I always think about these talents or these hidden superpowers as vehicles or channels that students can use to tell something much deeper about themselves. And so his talent and his skill really opened up a channel to be able to talk about being a child in a very large family and wanting to find a way to basically stand out amongst his siblings. And so as you start, as you and your child start thinking about what are the things that make them, don't overlook the small things. Often it's those seemingly smaller, insignificant things, those hobbies, those passions, those interests that really start defining who a student really is. And then lastly, purpose. So this idea of like, what gets you out of bed in the morning? And I will tell you, I think even as an adult, a lot of us are probably asking ourselves these same questions every day. It's oftentimes what prompts things like job changes or career pivots. I tell students, you don't have to have a nonprofit or 10 nonprofits or 15 activities on your activity list. At the end of the day, the gut test that I always use with students when I first start working with them is I ask them, you're all obviously incredibly busy. If you had a free day, you didn't have to go to school, you don't have to do anything, how would you choose to spend your time? And it's the students who sit there and get the furrowed brow and who can't quite come up with anything. I always tell them, this is now your homework. You need to start thinking about, that's just it. We all have the gift of free choice, but if you had a day off, how would you choose to spend your time? And that is what's going to start driving this idea of purpose. What are the things that are really driving everything that you are doing? What are the things that are driving the things that you want to become? Some good homework for students to start thinking about this is if you think about your high school career, I'll always ask students to think about and tell me, what types of roles do they play on teams typically? And what skills do they use to be effective both as communicators or leaders, depending on the types of roles they're playing on those various teams. And then start looking for patterns in their responses. So when you think about, if you were to ask someone, how would people describe you? Or when you're sort of exercising these talents and skills and superpowers, how does it make you feel? And more importantly, probably, how does it make others feel? And that'll start giving you a little more context for sort of how to start articulating what your profile, what your personal brand looks like. So this is really designed to be sort of a rough framework as you start thinking about building a brand as well. And so we've talked a little bit about some of these with sort of those anchors as well. So I won't spend too much time on the purpose piece, but I will just say this: as students are thinking about purpose, a lot of this is going to be defined by their end goals. It is okay to have more than one goal, or more importantly, it's okay to have phases. And so I have a lot of students who talk about, I know where I think I want to be 10, 15 years down the road. I just have no idea how to get there. working to build sort of tiered goals or making incremental progress is, I think, incredibly important, because number one, it breaks the pathway down for them into very manageable bite-sized chunks, but it also gives them a sense of how am I actually going to get there, and it becomes a much more realistic journey for them. The next piece of this is when you start thinking about your competition. And so I encourage students to always think about, when you're applying to schools, who are you competing against? And it's interesting because students will oftentimes, and parents as well, will oftentimes quote, acceptance rates, or they'll talk about how, this is the competition that we see. This is the average SAT score, this is the average GPA, et cetera. But I always like to remind students too, going back to that example about Harvard, especially when you're looking at elite institutions, or when you have students who are coming from elite high schools, you are not only competing against that much broader pool where, for all intents and purposes, you may already be in the upper 10, upper 5%. You're also competing against students from your own high school. So good high schools are going to produce high performers across the board. And so it's incredibly important to think about, how are you talking about yourself? How are you differentiating yourself, not only when it comes to the broader population, but thinking specifically about how are you differentiating yourself from students who might have similar profiles coming out of your own high school, out of your own town. As we all know, schools will only take a limited number from a certain high school or a certain geographic area. So thinking very specifically about your competitive sets and how are you differentiating within that set, in addition to the broader set. When you think about competition as well, you want to think about, what are students good at, or, what is your competition good at? What are you good at? And then more importantly, what are you better at? And use that to help fuel some of those differentiators. When we talk about audience, the knee-jerk reaction everyone comes up with is, we're talking to an admissions committee. What I try to remind students, though, is when you start talking to admissions committees, especially about things that you're excited and passionate about, you have to remember, though, you have to level the playing field. And so you can't necessarily assume that the person reading your application is going to be well read on all the things that you are interested in. And so it's important to distill language down to make it very, very approachable. I always encourage students, and this is the gut test of the litmus test that we'll use, is if they're talking about something super technical in an essay or something on a resume, I ask them to send it to someone from a slightly older generation. And so typically that is their grandparents, if they have grandparents, and ask them, if grandma or if nana or grandpa can decipher what you've just said, then you have done a good job of breaking the language down. But if it is entirely too technical, you want to make sure that you are really focusing on sort of the key points. What are the key points, and are you explaining them in a way that anyone who isn't a subject matter expert in this would be able to understand? Because again, you've got limited real estate when it comes to your application, so you want to make sure that you are being as effective but also as persuasive as possible. Mission statements, also probably better known as elevator pitches. So students, I'm seeing more and more now, and we started seeing this actually at the MBA level years ago, the idea of video essays. And so students having to submit a 60 or 90-second video essay, starting to see it a little bit more at the undergraduate level on occasion. But I think it's important, not only for video essays, but when you also think about interviews, when you think about just students going in and meeting with admissions folks, when you are taking campus tours, or when you are interviewing for internships or things like that, it is really, really important to be able to summarize those very key 2 or 3 points. What are the things that make you uniquely you, and what are you choosing to lead with? That really is going to tell sort of someone what are the things that you want to remember about you. And it also tells them or gives them signal about what is actually important to you as the individual. And so as you craft your mission statement, as you start thinking about those things, again, go back to this idea of purpose, authenticity, expertise. What are the things that are truly meaningful and impactful to you as an individual? And then lastly, this is sort of what brings it all together, this idea of brand voice. So thinking about, how do you want to be perceived? And again, you'll hear me harp a lot about this idea, this notion of authenticity. I think students get so caught up sometimes in trying to be what they believe someone else wants them to be. I hear students all the time who talk about, well, I Googled successful essays for a Harvard, or I Googled and I read 75 interview reports from someone. You don't necessarily need to align yourself. In fact, you shouldn't be aligning yourself with anyone else, because frankly, that's not the person who's applying to the university now. You are that individual. And so, just remembering, please do not lose your unique, authentic voice trying to be something that you think someone else wants to see or hear at a university. And this part, I think, as parents especially, this part is where I mean, I think where parents really come in, because you obviously know your children better than anyone. You have seen them grow, you have seen them evolve. And so you'll be a great litmus test if students are trying to sort of find that voice and sort of build out what that, what their personal mission statement looks like, what their POV looks like. And so again, just reiterating here, this idea of sort of that brand voice, really think about, and this is a great exercise students can do as well. When you think about what makes you unique, and then when you think about what you think your audience wants to hear, this is a great chance for students to be able to sort of list out those things in two lists and then looking for some of those overlaps. This is a great exercise students can do when it comes to just about any university or any program they might be interested in as well. So this is a great exercise that I start doing with students, sometimes as early as freshman or sophomore year even. This is not meant to be an essay necessarily that you're going to use for college, but this is a great way for students to start thinking about, how does the world see me? How do others see me? What are, again, going back to expertise, authenticity, purpose, what are those things that make me uniquely me? And how do we start sort of untangling all of that to start coming up with a narrative? And so these are some questions that I'll oftentimes give to students to think about. It'll start off as an exercise, sort of a list exercise, and then we'll start diving a little bit more deeply and probing a little bit more to see, how do those superpowers, how do those things that students take pride in sort of align with potentially what they want to do in the future, what types of academic interests they have, what types of clubs and organizations they're joining. And then at the end of the day, when you think about in a much broader sense, this idea of community, and I think number 4 is actually, again, a really great one to think about. I ask, the way that I'll tee this up with students oftentimes is I ask them to describe, what does your ideal partner look like? Or what does your ideal college roommate look like? And then start turning the tables and think about, how can I be that for others? And what, is what you've described, is that something, if you look in the mirror, are any of those traits that, that you embody? And so thinking a little bit more, a little bit more creatively, a little bit more personally, a little bit more critically, but all about all of these ideas and this sense of, who am I as a person? Who is the type of person I want to show up as on a university campus? And then how do I start now filtering all of this down, tying it and anchoring it to all of my passions, all of my interests, all of my activities in a way that is nice, neat, and cohesive? So spoiler alert, this is probably nothing new for folks, but as we all know, admissions are getting tougher. The impact of COVID was pretty significant. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have seen a lot of the headlines about the SAT and the ACT becoming optional, learning loss, application volumes at schools just kind of going through the roof. I think the impact of virtual environments really took a significant toll in many cases on students. I've seen a lot of students who have had challenges in terms of articulating involvement in activities. At the end of the day, these are all things that we're sort of looking backwards on. The takeaway here really for anyone, I think, is just understanding that admissions has become incredibly complicated. It is more competitive than ever. But what I always try to tell students and families is that you have to control what you can control. And so reading, sort of doom scrolling and reading all of these articles about how hard it is to get into college isn't going to necessarily do anyone any good. It's really important to start thinking about, okay, the landscape has changed. What are the things that I know to be true about myself? What can I absolutely control at this point? And then how can I leverage what I do have to put together the best possible version of myself, to put together the best possible story? Number 2, acceptance rate. So this sort of dovetails a little bit off of the first bullet. It's, as I mentioned at the beginning, acceptance rates are tough. It is really easy, again, to read those headlines, to hear that, Harvard and Penn and Brown all have admission rates that are, acceptance rates that are around 3.4%. I think the reality is, there's, the thing about data is, there's only so much you can read into data. I think there are a couple of interesting things to think about when you do start looking at some of these numbers. When you start looking at acceptance rates, and I'll use a couple of schools as an example, schools are typically going to report aggregated numbers. And so when you start looking particularly at larger state schools, and I use like the University of Michigan or the University of Virginia as 2 examples, the in-state versus out-of-state acceptance rates are going to be incredibly different. Michigan, Michigan, typically your in-state rate is right around 20%. Last year, their out-of-state was around 11 or 12%. For the University of Virginia, It's typically around 27% versus 12% for out of state. What this basically tells you is when you think and you start looking at these numbers, you need to start doing a little bit of digging to understand what are my chances based on the population that I fit in. So again, when you start thinking about your competition and your competitive set, that's certainly going to factor into it. The University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill has had record number of applications now, I believe 4 years running. It's interesting because when you start looking at the in-state numbers and you start breaking it down, what's interesting about North Carolina is that they actually will cap at 18%. So 18% of their students at least have to come from the state of North Carolina. And so the in-state admit rate, depending on the North Carolina school that you're applying to, can vary anywhere from 19 to 42%, depending on which campus you're applying to. For out of state, it has dropped to about 10 or 11%. And so again, when you start thinking about schools and you start thinking about which buckets to place them into, whether they're safeties, whether they're reaches or target schools, again, it's important. I just encourage families to do a little bit of digging into the numbers and make sure you understand what those numbers actually do mean. And you'll also find some variation as well based on the course of study that you're looking at as well. You'll find the University of Washington is one that I use pretty frequently. For many Washington State students, the University of Washington is often a safety school because their aggregate admit rate is a little over 60%. But when you start looking at non-residents, or when you start looking at some of their very competitive programs like engineering or computer science, those admit rates now drop to 3 or 4% for out-of-state students, especially when you're looking at those STEM programs. So again, it's really important to dive into the data. A lot of schools will post this information as part of student profiles. So the data is out there. You just need to know where to go look for it and understand what you're actually looking at. SAT and ACT, I think really the takeaway here is that, the SAT and ACT are out there. Most schools are test optional at this point. There is going to be a new version of the SAT that is rolling out. And certainly the team at Signet can help you navigate some of those waters if you have very specific questions. But what I will just say about SAT and ACT is that, typically if students, they are a good differentiator. And if students do have scores that are above a school's reported average, I encourage you to send them. And it's really just as simple as that. It gives students another data point when schools are looking holistically at that application. And a high test score can certainly help mitigate against potentially a transcript blunder or a blemish on your application. But I also encourage you not to get so wrapped up in this idea of testing that it consumes every piece of your admissions journey, and that it now cannibalizes something else that a student might have been working on. I remind students kind of in a tongue-in-cheek way, but I tell them you cannot list studying for the SAT or the ACT as an extracurricular activity on your activity list, even if it is taking up a significant portion of your time. This next idea of, what's better, and this is a question I get from families quite a bit, is it better to be well-rounded? Is it better to be a specialist? And, unfortunately, there isn't an easy answer here. For students who recognize very early on that have very strong passions, very strong talents in certain areas, it's fantastic for them to specialize. And when you start thinking about your narrative, when you start thinking about your activities that you put together throughout high school, it's obviously very easy to see some of those trends and some of those themes develop. For students, I think, who are well-rounded and who are good at a lot of very different things, I think in many ways, I think sometimes families are concerned that generalists can be sort of overlooked because you're not excellent at one thing, but you're very good at a lot of different things. And I encourage you to look at schools that tap into that. I think I'll use Brown as an example just because they were one of the first to introduce the idea of open curriculum. But I think it's really important, when you're looking at schools, to see, are there schools that, that align basically with this idea of being well-rounded? Are there schools that place a heavy emphasis on the importance of having a very broad, diverse liberal arts background or foundation, regardless of what it is you're studying? Georgetown, no bias, not really, is another great example of that, where they require 2 semesters of a natural science, 2 semesters of a philosophy, 2 semesters of a foreign language. The idea is that no matter what school you're in or what you're studying, they want everyone to have a very broad liberal arts foundation because they believe that well-read students are going to be the best professionals out there, and they're going to have the most to contribute. The last thing I just wanted to touch on really briefly here, because it is something that we do get a lot of questions about, is the impact of the recent Supreme Court ruling. The reality is that this does not affect most people unless you're talking about sort of the top 25 schools. But I do encourage families, and especially students who are BIPOC, to think about your comfort level in making identity part of your brand story. There are a lot of students who do not want to necessarily make this a part of their story, and that is perfectly fine. You want to, though, as you are considering what your personal brand, what that narrative is going to look like, I encourage families just to think about how does that, if at all, play into your narrative, and is that something that you organically want to incorporate? You'll see that a lot of schools, and there was I think I know Sheila has put out a couple of blog posts, and there's been quite a bit of chatter around new essay topics that have rolled out this year, and I'm sure this won't be the first or the last we'll hear of it. But I would definitely encourage you to check out some of that information and resources. There are a lot of schools that are updating their essay prompts to create space very naturally for students to be able to talk about what makes them different, diverse, and unique when it comes to identity. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about the importance of fit. And so this list is certainly not an exhaustive list, but I do encourage you, as you start thinking about admissions, most schools will employ what they call a holistic admissions approach, which means that they are looking at all of these things. They really want to understand what makes a student tick and recognize that not every student is going to excel at every single thing. And so a lot of the things on this list are very obvious, but I do think it's important as you start looking at schools to make sure that you are tracking what are the things that certain schools do require and what do they not. And so a great example would be the University of California school system. They do not accept test scores. They do not accept letters of recommendation. And even when you look at your transcript, they will not accept your transcript as is. They have their own platform where you will enter in your grades in your coursework based on sort of a rubric that they have. Again, it's really important just to make sure that whichever school you're looking at, you're working to understand what are the types of things that schools are asking for and why. I think that this idea of also having a very distinct point of view or POV, that is obviously going to come through in essays. It's also really important to think about what are other places in your application, supplemental essays, the activity list, potentially a resume, potentially interviews. Where can you insert different perspectives or different parts of your personality and your background into other parts of your application? I talk to students a lot about how their application is one really big jigsaw puzzle. And so every piece of their application is going to fit one of these puzzle pieces. And the idea here is you don't want to be redundant. You don't want to say the exact same thing in everything, but you do want to try to make the most of each of those puzzle pieces. I think oftentimes letters of recommendation are one of the most overlooked areas because students just, they're happy that a teacher said yes, and they submit their teacher's name via the Common App portal, whatever that platform may be. But, I always encourage students to think about, this is another puzzle piece in your application. If there are places in your application where you wanted to talk about an amazing project that you did in junior year that you did for a particular teacher, and you don't have space in an essay to talk about it because you choose to talk about other things, make sure that you're putting together these one-page brag sheets to teachers. Give them guidance so that way they know what are some of the things that were memorable about a particular class or a particular activity. Have them, remind them about that project that meant so much to you. I think oftentimes students don't take the time to think about or sort of how teachers perceive them. And so the things that students think that are really important or maybe really memorable or made an impression aren't always the same things that a teacher is going to come up with. And so being able to give teachers that guidance, and particularly, I always encourage students to highlight some of these soft skills. What are 2 soft skills that you developed or excelled at potentially while you were in that particular class, while you were participating in that activity? Make sure that you're picking different soft skills for all of your letter writers. So that way your letter writers are not saying the exact same thing. They're tangential because obviously there are going to be some common themes, but you want to make sure, again, that you're making the most of all of that real estate in your application. Because again, holistically, the school is going to look at this package as a whole. So I wanted to do just a quick deep dive into what schools are, students are always asked, what are schools looking for? Again, a little biased, sorry, with the Georgetown, but I do think that Georgetown and Columbia present 2 really great opportunities to talk about and look at how schools present themselves and how they are really giving students a roadmap for what they are looking for in successful applicants. Now, I will say I did boldface this. I realize it doesn't come through quite as nicely as I would have liked on the slide. But when you think about these 2 schools on the surface, what do they have in common? They are both elite private schools. They are on the East Coast. They are in large metropolitan areas. So a lot of similarities on the surface. But when you look at Georgetown, they talk about Georgetown is a Jesuit university. It's based in Washington, D.C. They highlight this idea, though, because they are a Jesuit university rooted deep in Jesuit philosophy, that they are looking to educate the whole person. This idea, this notion of cura personalis is one of the values that Georgetown espouses and really embodies. They're looking for well-roundedness. When you look at their mission statement, they talk about sustained discourse among people of different faiths. So this idea of diversity, of provoking critical thinking, and intellectual thought. This idea that beliefs promote intellectual, ethical, and spiritual understanding. So again, students who are well-rounded. I talked a little bit about the very broad liberal arts requirements that all students are required to take. That is how they're feeding into this. When you think about the sort of this idea of diversity and community, they talk about we are a forward-looking, diverse community devoted to social justice, restless inquiry, and respect. When you look at Georgetown applicants and successful students who apply to Georgetown, the number one activity on students' list is community service or volunteer work, hands down, and it has been that way for years. It is something that Georgetown lives, breathes, comes right out, and it tells folks, we want you to be a part of the community. We want to see how you are making the world around you a better place. When you look at their values, again, this idea of cura personalis, the idea of educating people as a whole, they talk about this notion of being men and women for others, not just for yourself, but for others. Yes, they are an academically rigorous institution, but you don't necessarily see them leading with that here. On the flip side, when you look at Columbia leads right out of the gates. World's most important centers of research, distinguished learning environments. Hands down, Columbia is valuing academics. They are valuing research. When you look, they talk about advanced knowledge and learning. Both schools obviously value academics, but when you look at how they position it in their language, the way that they are positioning themselves, Columbia is leading with that right away. And so it's not to say that Georgetown is a better fit than Columbia or that Columbia is a better fit than Georgetown. But when you think about, and when you and your children are talking about schools and researching schools and thinking about this idea of fit, you really want to think about, where am I going to get a good, solid academic experience? But what are the things that are most important to me in my home for the next 4 years? Is it distinguished learning environment, center of research, and potentially, in an R1 institution, or are there other things that I want to pursue in addition to that and that it may be equally important? And so I encourage you to think about that. Schools, again, like I said, schools really provide this roadmap for students and for families. So it's one of the first places that I send my students to go start doing some research when we start talking about schools. The other thing that I encourage students to think about too is this is a great tool for internships and for jobs as well. And so a lot of the folks that I work with, college students and young professionals, people always talk about, the job description is sort of your roadmap. But when you go to companies' websites, again, do your due diligence, do your homework, go to the about page and learn about a company's mission and value statements. Yes, there are a lot of similarities, just as you'll see with universities. But when you start digging into the language and into the way that these schools and these companies are positioning themselves, it is creating a lot of very natural space for folks to lean in a much more authentic way. So what can you do now? So I know we have mostly juniors here, but I do want to run through everything on the list here. So for folks who have freshmen and sophomores, establish a strong academic base. Encourage your students, your children, to take challenging courses. Make sure that they are focused on grades. It's really important to make sure that they are finding that balance and striking that balance between challenging themselves, but also being able to execute on it. When it comes to extracurriculars or sports, it's good to pick 1 to 3 to come out of the gate with. You can certainly refine as you go, but you don't need to be signing up for every single club. Just because the Common App gives you 10 slots to list activities does not mean you have to have 10 activities. It's more important to have high quality activities and things that you have participated in and grown and evolved with over throughout the course of high school. As you'll see, and I'll jump ahead to junior year just for a second with activities, as you start getting into junior and senior year, it's important then to start either seeking out or creating organically these leadership opportunities for yourselves within these clubs and activities. Again, schools want to see how you're growing and evolving with those. For summer, for sophomores, for freshmen and sophomores, it's really important, learn and do. That's sort of the mantra that I tell students, learn something, do something. It's always obviously important to make sure that you are spending time reading. Freshmen and sophomores can take advantage of that time, take some SAT and ACT practice tests to make sure that you are coming up with a plan for testing, because again, jumping ahead to junior year, that's really when you should start taking those official tests, making sure that you're giving yourself enough of a runway to be able to allow yourself enough time to both prepare and retest if need be. And again, our team, the team at Signet is wonderful. We have folks who can certainly walk you through or kind of counsel you through what that might look like for your child, depending on where you are in the process. The one thing I will say for parents as well here too is just to start planning ahead for finances. A lot of folks do not always realize, especially if you haven't gone through this process before, that for FAFSA, you will need to submit financial records tax returns for the last 2 years. And so it's important freshman and sophomore year to make sure that you are just starting to get your affairs in order so that you can plan ahead for that junior and senior year. Moving ahead to junior year, keeping your grades up. This is probably something that a lot of folks have heard. This is the most important academic year, though, because it is the last complete data set that schools are going to have when evaluating your child's application. Depending on if students are applying early or regular decision, yes, there will be senior year grades that schools will see, but junior year is the last complete data set that schools will have. And so that is just a great snapshot for schools to be able to see how students are doing in the classroom. Refining school lists, starting to think about early action, early decision, regular decision. Those are all things that will happen typically in spring of junior year. Identifying those teachers for letters of recommendation. This is so important, especially if your child is applying early action or early decision. Make sure that you are talking to your teachers and asking for those letters before you leave on summer break. A lot of students will wait until, or think that they can wait until they get back in the fall, with those deadlines being mid-October, early November. In theory, it seems like that's enough time, but we all know that the hustle and bustle of going back to school in late August, early September, things are frenetic for families. They are frenetic for teachers. It is far better to make sure that you're locking up those letters before you leave for summer break. Even better yet, a lot of the work that I do with my juniors over the summer is working on those one-pagers that they can then send to their teachers. So teachers have all of that stuff over the summer. And given the number of letters that teachers are asked to write, quite frankly, I find more often than not that teachers are really appreciative of receiving that guidance as early as possible. Summer is also a great time to get a head start on those essays. The Common App prompts typically do not change significantly year over year. So there's a really great head start students can get in terms of drafting a personal statement, if not starting to work on some of those supplemental essays as well. And then finally, for seniors, applications and financial aid are big, as well as scholarships. And I would just say that, a word on scholarships, for many scholarships, you are oftentimes parallel tracking that with your college applications. And so it's just important to keep that in mind and make sure you're doing your due diligence ahead of time. I know we have packed a lot into 15 minutes. We do have a little bit of time for Q&A. We're happy to open up the chat, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for choosing to spend a bit of time with us. I know there's a lot to consider when you start thinking about college admissions and sort of your journey there. So I applaud you all for taking time out of your busy schedules and choosing to make that investment in your child and in your family.
Thank you, Joanna. That was great. It was definitely a lot, so I'm sure there are questions. Feel free to come off chat or come off mute and ask your question directly, or you can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand. I'll call on you, however you want to do it. Just give us your questions. I know you have questions. Don't be shy.
I did such a great job, Sheila. There's nothing.
You explained it all. Everybody's a college admissions expert now.
This is very specific, and it's about testing, and
Okay.
I can't even believe I'm asking a testing question. You had said that if your student scores better than the average, then definitely submit the test. I guess, what if they score really well but not above the average? Is the recommendation then don't submit the score?
I really think it's a judgment call. It depends on how close they are to the average. If it's, we're talking the SAT, it's 10 points away from the average, I think that's fine. If we're talking 50, 60 points away from the average, probably not.
Okay.
Yeah. Joanna, would you add anything to that?
I would just say too that, and because I think that was a perfect, it was a perfect response, Sheila. I agree completely with everything. Just remember that you don't have to send your school scores to every single school either. So I have a lot of students, depending on, again, which schools they're applying to, their scores are going to certain schools, but not others. And also depending on academic major. So oftentimes students may opt to apply. For example, so I have a student, for example, I've worked with a few years ago, who applied to a handful of schools, to their business schools. but there were a handful of schools that he then opted to apply as a liberal arts major. And so depending then, again, you can start doing a little bit of digging to see what those averages look like. For anything, for example, that maybe is a slightly more quant heavy or STEM focused major, you want to sort of scrutinize those math subscores a little bit more before you opt to send them. And so it can be a very school specific, a school specific decision as well.
Thank you for the question, Leah.
You're welcome.
We have a question in the chat. When you are talking about the average score, are we talking about the midpoint of the 25th to 75th percentile, not the low end of that range? Joanna, you want to take that?
Sure. So it's a great question. Some schools will report an average score. And so if it is that average score, it's very cut and dry. But typically for those ranges, I encourage students, if it's sort of the midpoint to upper 75th percentile, again, to Sheila's point, it's kind of a judgment call, but typically if you're somewhere in that 50th to 75th percentile, more likely than not, it's certainly, it will more likely than not benefit you. I also encourage families to think about what does your transcript look like as well. And again, I'll pick on math for just a second. You want to think about what is the anomaly if there is a difference, for example, between the scores that you have on a standardized test and the grades you have on a transcript. And so think about which is going to help further the narrative and what, where does sort of the anomaly lie? And sort of, again, thinking about just that larger holistic picture.
Thank you. Cindy, you've got your hand raised. You want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you both, Sheila, Joanna. I think my question is really regarding the recommendation teachers you want to ask for those recommendations, and beyond teachers, how do you go by asking other people to give that recommendation?
It's a great question.
It's a great question, Cindy. So what I would encourage you to do is that many schools will give some guidance already. So depending on what your student, which school they're applying to within a university, so again, some areas of study will specifically say we would like at least one letter from a STEM teacher, or we would like at least one letter from a humanities teacher. And so I think it's important first as you're starting to put together that school list and creating this checklist, look for some of those overlaps. And I think that's certainly going to be sort of your first guide. When you think about letters of recommendation from folks who are not teachers, students oftentimes, if they have been involved in an extracurricular activity, whether it's a sport or some type of club where they've had a faculty sponsor for 4 years, and that person really knows them well and they've done quite a bit, it's perfectly acceptable to ask someone like that who can speak about, again, and I think probably more so those leadership qualities, those soft skills. Again, you want to be really thoughtful in terms of what you're asking a letter writer to talk about, and not just ask them because it's someone who knows you really well. You do want to be very, very specific.
Thank you. We just got a bunch of questions in. So let's talk about early decision versus regular. How do you advise people to decide that sort of strategy?
Another great question. So I think there are a couple ways to think about early decision versus regular. And then you also have to factor in this idea of early action and this pesky little round called early decision too, that some schools also offer. What I would say is that the difference, for those of you who are not familiar, early action is non-binding. So that is basically for schools who come out and say, if you are really interested in our university, if you love our university and want to apply early, it's a smaller application pool typically, but it is not legally binding. Early decision, on the other hand, though, is legally binding. So it's for students who say, I love your university. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, this is my top choice. I know this is where I want to be. This is where I see myself. And I am willing to sign a contract that says, if you let me in, I am coming. Those are sort of the two extremes. There are some other flavors of restrictive early action and things like that. I won't necessarily get into those tonight because those are more one-off choices, but certainly happy to, a lot of this is conversation. These are conversations that I have with families all the time. But basically, I think early action versus early decision, the idea here is that you can also apply to multiple early action programs. Typically, since they are not binding, early decision, you can only apply to one school early decision. I will just make a quick note about early decision too. there are a handful of schools like NYU, WashU are a couple of examples where there is sort of this sandwich round. The applications are typically due the same time as the regular decision applications, so early January, but it is also binding. Students essentially will find out before the regular decision applications or decisions are released. This really allows for students who either applied early decision and were not admitted to their top choice to apply to another school and sort of have the benefit of that smaller applicant pool. And so there is that sort of ED2 sandwich round. And then regular decision is just the broader application, basically the broader bucket for everyone else who is applying. Those deadlines are typically anywhere from early January, sometime to as late as February 1st. But students are typically finding out later in the spring, and that's the more traditional timetable that you hear about. Sheila, did I miss anything? I know there's a lot to cover with regards to
No, you've got it. I mean, we could go on for a really long time about ED versus EA versus regulars, a lot of data that you can look into. And then you've got to think about your strategy. What's the waterfall effect? So certainly maybe another webinar that we do
Definitely
on that. Let's go to Varsha. You had your hand raised for a little while.
Sure. I'm trying to lower my hand. Oh, I did it. Okay. I appreciated when you were talking about learning about a school and fit, and you were talking about reading a website and looking at scores and stuff. But I also appreciated that you talked about some qualitative ways of, information about what a school is like, and using that kind of information too to understand, to help determine fit. And I'm wondering what other kinds of resources you suggest that can give you like a sense of the school, a feel of the school that is different from numbers.
Yeah, no, it's great. So here's I'll show a caveat with this. I think social media can be helpful in certain doses. And so, a lot of times students, we'll talk about, using sites like Reddit or, TikTok obviously is a big go-to for a lot of students as well. I think there are certain things that can be gleaned through social media because you do get a much more raw, unfiltered, and oftentimes a student perspective on what life is like at universities. I urge students though not to lean too heavily into that though, because again, I think a lot of that content is still very, very filtered and very manufactured in many ways. I think one of the best things that students can do, and it's funny because this is just taking a page out of the, this is basically just taking a page out of the adult sort of networking playbook as well. And that is to start asking your friends, asking your family, do you know someone who went to school here? One of the things that I will say that I've done, having done this for 22 years, is I have such an extensive virtual Rolodex of students who tell me, let me talk to someone. If you have someone applying to Gallatin at NYU, I would love to talk to them about what that program was like. It's amazing, I think, what you can do when you start tapping into your own network. The kids on the lacrosse team, the neighbors, the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, and think about every network you possibly have access to. You would be amazed at how many folks know someone who went to a school there. And I think being able to have, reaching out and just asking for that, can I have a virtual 15 or 30-minute coffee chat? Although I don't know what the high school equivalent of coffee chat would be. But asking them, can I just ask you a couple questions? This is also really great practice though, too, I tell students, for practicing that elevator pitch, because they have to introduce themselves and then talk to someone and tell them why they're even thinking about the school. So it's sort of a win-win in many ways.
Great question. Okay, we're going to try to do this one as quickly as possible. I think this is a really good question. Is it more beneficial for a student to work or volunteer during their free time?
Great question. And you're going to hate my answer because I'm going to say it depends. So what I'll give you a very tactical example. Volunteer work is fantastic. And you heard me talk a lot about the value of community service and volunteer work. There are a lot of students though who are financing their way through college or through high school potentially. I was one of them. For students who have to work because they are saving up to pay for a good portion of their college tuition, working is perfectly acceptable. You want to be able to make sure that you are explaining that though in your application. Schools will give students the benefit of the doubt, but they also like to see, again, I think that fiscal responsibility, it is a huge deal if you are taking on that type of financial burden yourself as a 17 or 18-year-old. But again, it's important to make sure that you are providing context around that so that the school understands that if you were, I have a lot of families who ask, what if it's working retail or rating tables? It doesn't feel like a very involved or intellectual activity. But if that is what a student can do to earn money, to be able to help pay their way through college, that activity has just as much value.
Thank you, Joanna. What a great nuanced answer for an it depends question. They kind of all depend, right? Well, we've run out of time, but thank you all so much for joining us and for your great questions, and Joanna for all of the wonderful wisdom that you shared with us. I muted myself. I'm putting my email in the chat right now. If you have more questions, you want to work with Joanna, or you have a question for Joanna specifically, send it over my way. I will make sure it gets answered and get back to you. We will be sending out a recording of this talk. Feel free to share it with your friends. Most of you who joined us joined through our new How to Get Into College community. That is free membership, and there are a lot of great resources there. Since there are so many parents of juniors here, I want to highlight we are going to be doing a boot camp for parents of juniors in November, which is going to be really exciting, taking you through all the major milestones of junior year and what you need to know. So look out for information on that. And I hope you join us again for a future webinar. Thank you all so much. Have a great night.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Good night, Joanna. Bye.
Bye.